Charlemagne's empire stretched from the North Sea to central Italy. It was the largest unified realm Western Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. Yet within a single generation of his passing, that colossal structure began to crumble into pieces. This is the story of that great unraveling, a century-long drama of ambition, betrayal, and failure that forged the very shape of Europe. By the end of this exploration, you will understand not just why the empire fell apart, but how its ghost continued to haunt every ruler who tried to put it back together. We will follow the desperate attempts to glue the fragments back into a whole, attempts that always seem to shatter in the hands of the next generation. This chaotic period, often skipped over in history books, directly created the world of knights and castles and laid the foundations for the modern nations of France and Germany. How does a civilization hold itself together when the one person who bound it all together is gone? Charlemagne's empire was a masterpiece of personal rule, but its genius was also its greatest weakness. The entire structure rested on a single, unbreakable bond, the personal oath of loyalty between the emperor and his most powerful men. These men, the counts, were the empire's backbone. Appointed by Charlemagne himself, they governed local districts, collected taxes, and raised armies. To keep them honest, he created a brilliant surveillance system, the missi dominici, or the envoys of the Lord. These were pairs of trusted officials, often one a bishop and one a noble, who traveled the realm as the emperor's eyes and ears. They would arrive unannounced, hear grievances, review the count's administration, and ensure the emperor's laws were being followed. It was a powerful check on local power, but it only worked because everyone feared and respected the man who sent them. Wealth flowed through this system like blood, and its primary pump was constant military victory. Successful campaigns against the Saxons, the Avars, and others brought back immense plunder, land, and tribute. Charlemagne used this wealth to reward his loyal followers, funding the construction of palaces, churches, and monasteries. This created a cycle of prosperity. Conquest bred loyalty, and loyalty enabled further conquest. The church was the other crucial pillar. Charlemagne presented himself as God's chosen ruler, a new King David. In return for his protection and generous funding, bishops and abbots provided the empire with its administrative clerks, its moral authority, and its unifying ideology. They crowned him emperor in Rome on Christmas Day, an event that was less a beginning and more a recognition of a partnership already in full swing. But here lies the fatal flaw. This entire intricate machine was engineered for expansion under a single, charismatic driver. It was not built for a quiet, peaceful inheritance. The system assumed the emperor would always be strong enough to command personal loyalty and rich enough to buy it with the spoils of war. What happens when the wars stop and the plunder dries up? What happens when the powerful counts no longer look to a distant capital for their authority and wealth, but begin to see the land they govern as their own? The structure had no answer for static borders or for a ruler who could not project the same overwhelming force as its founder. The empire was a magnificent castle, but its foundation was the shifting sand of personal allegiance, and its walls were held together by the constant pressure of outward expansion. Once that pressure was gone, the walls were destined to lean and then to fall. Charlemagne himself was the first to draw the lines on the map. In the year 806, with his own hand, he drafted a document known as the Divisio Imperii, the division of the empire. This was not a plan for unity, but a blueprint for its end. He envisioned the Carolingian realm not as a single, indivisible state, but as a vast family estate to be divided among his 3 surviving sons, just as a farmer might split his land between his children. The eldest, Charles the Younger, would receive the Frankish heartlands, a core stretching from the Rhine to Paris. The second son, Pepin, was granted Italy. The youngest, Louis, who was already ruling in Aquitaine, would keep his southern territories. The plan had a cold political logic. Each son would be a king in his own right, sovereign within his borders, expected to keep peace with his brothers. There was no provision for a supreme emperor over them all. The document painstakingly outlined borders, listed cities, and detailed how military aid should flow between the brothers in times of external threat. It was a meticulous arrangement for a peaceful separation, acknowledging that the empire's sheer size made personal rule from a single center impossible. It was an admission that the bonds of blood and treaty were stronger than the abstract idea of a unified realm. This was the inheritance model of the time, and it made perfect sense to everyone involved. The empire was property, not a political idea, but then fate intervened. Within a few years, both of the elder sons, Charles and Pepin, passed away. By the year 813, only Louis, the youngest, remained. In a solemn ceremony, Charlemagne, now an aging man, summoned Louis from Aquitaine, crowned him co-emperor, and presented him with the imperial sword. The careful division of 806 was suddenly irrelevant. The entire staggering inheritance fell into the hands of one man, Louis, who would become known to history as Louis the Pious. The crisis of fragmentation had been postponed, not prevented. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might hold. Unity had been restored by accident, by loss, creating a dangerous illusion that the colossal structure could be maintained intact by a single heir. The ghost of a unified empire was given a second life, but it was a life built on a foundation of grief and happenstance, not on a system designed to last. Louis the Pious inherited an empire whole, but he faced a problem his father never had to solve. How do you keep it that way? Charlemagne had built his realm through conquest, a constant outward push that bound his followers to him with shared purpose and shared plunder. Louis, a deeply religious man, inherited a realm with static borders. There were no great pagan armies left to conquer, no vast treasures to distribute. His challenge was not expansion, but consolidation. His reign would become a decades-long experiment in designing a government that could survive its founder, the first real struggle to rebuild a permanent imperial structure. His answer arrived in the year 817, a revolutionary document called the Ordinatio Imperii, the Ordinance of the Empire. This was not a simple will dividing property. It was a constitutional blueprint for the future, an attempt to legislate unity from the top down. Louis declared the empire to be one and indivisible, a sacred entity that must not be torn apart. To preserve it, he made a radical choice. He appointed his eldest son, Lothar, as co-emperor and his direct successor. Lothar would bear the imperial title and hold supreme authority over the entire realm from the moment of his father's passing. The younger sons, Pepin and Louis the German, were not cast aside. They were granted sub-kingdoms, Aquitaine and Bavaria respectively, but they were to rule these lands as kings under the watchful eye and ultimate command of their elder brother, the Emperor Lothar. This was a hierarchy written into law, a pyramid of power with one man firmly at the top. It was a brilliant idea on parchment. For the first time, someone had tried to replace the messy, personal bonds of loyalty with a clear, legal framework for unity. The Ordinatio Imperii envisioned a federation of kingdoms, all orbiting a single, powerful sun. It sought to prevent the very civil wars that would later tear the empire apart by establishing the rules of succession before anyone could dispute them. But a law is only as strong as the willingness of people to obey it, and Louis had underestimated two powerful forces, the ambition of his own family and the entrenched power of the regional nobility. The great lords had grown accustomed to a certain independence during the final years of Charlemagne's long reign. They watched Louis's plan with deep suspicion. A strong, centralized emperor in Lothar meant less power for them. Their loyalties began to quietly shift, not to the distant idea of an empire, but to the local kings who lived among them, Pepin in Aquitaine and Louis in Bavaria. These younger sons, though given subordinate roles, now had their own courts, their own armies, and their own followers who saw their future tied to a regional king, not a distant emperor. The Ordinatio Imperii, designed to prevent conflict, had inadvertently created the very factions that would fuel it. It drew a map of the future that too many powerful people had a stake in redrawing. Louis the Pious's grand design for unity was about to meet the most disruptive force in dynastic politics, a new heir. After the death of his first wife, Louis married a remarkable young woman named Judith. In 823, she gave birth to a son, Charles. The arrival of this fourth son, who would be known to history as Charles the Bald, was a political earthquake. The Ordinatio Imperii had been a perfect closed system for three brothers. It had no room for a fourth. For Judith, a fiercely intelligent and ambitious mother, the situation was unacceptable. Her son Charles had been given nothing, no kingdom, no future, while his three half-brothers held all the power. She began a relentless campaign at court, using her influence to secure lands and a title for her boy, chipping away at the inheritance of the older sons. This was not just a family quarrel, it was a constitutional crisis. The older brothers, Lothar, Pepin, and Louis the German, saw their carefully allotted futures being stolen by an infant. The powerful nobles saw an opportunity. Those who felt sidelined by Louis's pious reforms and centralizing efforts now flocked to the banners of the disgruntled older sons, whispering that their father was being manipulated, that the empire's stability was being sacrificed for a baby's cradle. In 830, the simmering tension exploded into open rebellion. The three elder brothers, in a shocking act of defiance, raised armies against their own father, the emperor. They claimed they were not rebels, but reformers seeking to rescue the empire from bad advisors and a scheming stepmother. This was the first of several civil wars that would consume the next decade. Louis was forced to dismiss Judith, send her to a convent, and publicly humiliate himself before his sons. But the peace was fragile. The brothers fell out among themselves, and Louis, with surprising resilience, staged a comeback, restoring his authority and bringing Judith and young Charles back to court. The conflict reached its tragic climax in the summer of 833. Louis marched his army to a place called the Field of Lies in Alsace to face the forces of his son Lothar, who had rebelled again. What happened next was less a battle and more a masterpiece of political betrayal. Overnight, Louis's army, bribed and persuaded by Lothar's agents, simply melted away. The emperor woke to find himself alone, abandoned by almost every one of his supporters. He was taken prisoner by his own son. In a grotesque ceremony of humiliation, Lothar forced his father to publicly confess to a long list of invented crimes, to lay down his arms, and to don the rough sackcloth of a penitent. The image was devastating. The emperor of Christendom, stripped of all authority, rendered a pitiful figure by his own flesh and blood. The Field of Lies was more than a family betrayal. It was the moment the imperial idea itself was stripped naked and broken. It proved that no law, no ordinance, could bind the ambitions of princes or the loyalties of nobles when their own interests were at stake. The framework Louis had built with such care was now irrevocably shattered. From this point on, the question was no longer how to preserve the empire, but who would get the largest pieces when it was finally torn apart. Louis the Pious died in 840. A broken man haunted by the rebellions of his sons. The empire he had tried so hard to keep whole was now a prize to be fought over by the last three standing, Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. Their conflict, a brutal civil war between brothers, raged for 3 more years, tearing through the heart of Europe. armies marched and countermarched, laying waste to farmland and draining the treasuries that had once funded cathedrals. The nobility, those powerful counts and bishops, were now the ultimate power brokers, switching sides between the brothers, not out of loyalty to an imperial idea, but in exchange for promises of land and autonomy. The empire was no longer being governed, it was being auctioned off. Exhaustion finally brought them to the table. In the year 843, the three brothers met in the city of Verdun. Their goal was not to restore their grandfather's realm, but to carve it up permanently. The agreement they produced, the Treaty of Verdun, is one of the most important documents in European history, for it did not just end a war, it drew the map of a continent. The treaty took the sprawling Carolingian Empire and sliced it into 3 vertical strips. Charles the Bald received the western portion, West Francia. This land, west of the Rhine and Scheldt rivers, spoke mostly Romance dialects that would evolve into French. It was the region of Paris and the Seine Valley, a territory whose identity was already coalescing around a different cultural center. Louis the German was granted the eastern lands, East Francia. This was the realm east of the Rhine, a world of Germanic tribes and customs, a landscape of forests and rivers that pointed toward a future very different from that of the West. In the middle, running like a precarious spine from the North Sea down to central Italy, was the portion given to the eldest brother, the Emperor Lothar. This was Middle Francia, a bizarre, elongated territory containing some of the empire's most coveted and contentious cities, Aachen, the imperial capital itself, as well as Rome and the papal lands. Lothar also kept the now largely empty title of emperor. On the surface, the division seemed fair, a neat tripartite split, but the geopolitical logic was fatally flawed. The brothers were not thinking in terms of creating viable, defensible nations. They were thinking like heirs dividing a family estate, obsessed with ensuring each portion had an equal share of wealth, prestige, and symbolic sites. The result was the Middle Kingdom, a geographic monstrosity. It was a 1,000-mile-long corridor with no natural borders, no geographic core, and no cultural unity. To the north, it included Frisia and the Low Countries. In the center, it held the Rhineland, Alsace, and Burgundy. To the south, it reached through the Alps to encompass Lombardy in Italy. This kingdom was impossible to administer, impossible to defend, and contained within it every future flashpoint in European history. It was a zone designed for conflict, a permanent buffer state that would be fought over for centuries. The Treaty of Verdun solved an immediate family dispute by creating a long-term continental crisis. It formalized the end of a unified Western Empire, replacing it with 3 rival kingdoms whose borders were not lines of defense, but lines of ambition. In one stroke, the ghost of Charlemagne's realm was laid to rest, and in its place rose the rough, competing shapes of what would become France and Germany, with a bloody corridor of contested land forever between them. The Middle Kingdom was a political ghost from the moment it was drawn on the map. Lothar I, holding that impossibly long strip of territory and the hollowed-out title of emperor, spent his remaining years not governing an empire, but simply trying to hold his own fragile inheritance together. He was a ruler trapped in a geographical nightmare, constantly pulled between threats from his brothers to the east and west, and the need to manage the distant, restless nobles of Italy. When he passed away in 855, the fate of his kingdom was sealed not by external enemies, but by the very same divisive logic that had created it. Lothar, following the family tradition, had 3 sons of his own, and just as their grandfather Louis the Pious had done, they saw the realm not as a sacred entity, but as a family estate to be divided. In a quiet monastery in the town of Prüm that same year, the brothers signed a treaty that carved the already precarious Middle Kingdom into 3 even smaller, more vulnerable pieces. The eldest son, Louis II, received the imperial crown and the Kingdom of Italy, anchoring his power in the south but leaving him disconnected from the Frankish heartlands. The middle son, Lothar II, was given the northern core, a territory that would bear his name for centuries, Lotharingia. This was the rich land of the Rhine Valley, the Low Countries, and Burgundy. The youngest, Charles, was granted the southernmost portion, the Kingdom of Provence, a realm centered on the Rhone River Valley and the Mediterranean coast. With a few strokes of a pen, the Treaty of Prüm completed the fragmentation that Verdun had begun. The great middle strip was gone, replaced by a jigsaw of sibling rivalries. This was more than just another family quarrel. It was the final, decisive blow to any realistic hope of reuniting Charlemagne's empire. Think of it like a shattered pane of glass. The Treaty of Verdun was the first major crack, splitting the window into 3 large pieces. The Treaty of Prüm took the most unstable middle piece and smashed it into a handful of sharp, irregular shards. Once that happens, gluing everything back into a single, perfect sheet becomes a practical impossibility. The pieces are too many, their edges too jagged, and they no longer fit the original frame. Geographically, the dream of a unified empire was now dead. No single ruler could possibly reassemble all these territories, from the Frisian coast to the Roman countryside, under one administration. The political energy of the age shifted decisively. Ambitious men no longer looked to rebuild a continent-spanning realm. They looked to consolidate power within these new, smaller kingdoms. The counts and dukes within Lotharingia, Italy, and Provence now answered to local kings who were often weaker than their own powerful nobles. These regional rulers, like the fierce Robert the Strong in West Francia or the ambitious margraves of the East Frankish frontier, began to build their own durable power bases, laying the foundations for the feudal duchies and counties that would define the next era. The rapid dissolution of the Middle Kingdom proved a harsh lesson. Unity on the scale Charlemagne achieved was a fleeting accident of personality and conquest, not a sustainable political system. The map of Europe was now a patchwork, and from this patchwork, entirely new patterns were about to emerge. Charles the Bald spent his entire life chasing a ghost. The kingdom he inherited, West Francia, was a realm in perpetual crisis, its borders leaking authority to powerful nobles like Robert the Strong. Yet Charles's gaze was fixed not on consolidating his own shaky throne, but eastward toward the splintered remains of the Middle Kingdom and the empty title of emperor that came with it. His reign became a masterclass in the painful gap between imperial ambition and royal reality. For decades, he engaged in a dizzying series of wars, alliances, and betrayals with his brothers and nephews, all aimed at scooping up pieces of Lotharingia, that rich central corridor. He was not trying to rebuild Charlemagne's empire out of nostalgia. He was playing a brutal game of geopolitical chess. Every city, every fertile valley he could pry from his relatives meant more wealth, more soldiers, and a stronger claim to be the true heir of Charlemagne. This was not a quest for unity, but for personal supremacy, a desperate attempt to outshine his rivals by wearing the grandest crown in Christendom. The prize finally seemed within reach in the year 875. His nephew, the Emperor Louis II, ruler of Italy, passed away without a direct heir. The imperial title, still shimmering with symbolic power, was suddenly up for grabs. Charles moved with stunning speed. He crossed the Alps into Italy, not with a massive army, but with a chest of gold and promises. He bought the loyalty of the Italian nobles and, most crucially, secured the support of the Pope. In a lavish ceremony in Rome on Christmas Day, deliberately echoing his grandfather's coronation 75 years earlier, Pope John VIII placed the imperial crown on Charles's head. He was now Charles II, Holy Roman Emperor. In that moment, draped in silks and hailed by the crowds, the ghost appeared to be made flesh once more. The title was everything he had fought for, a sacred mandate from God that placed him, in theory, above all other kings in the West. It was the ultimate validation, a declaration that he, not Louis the German in the East, was the legitimate successor to Charlemagne's legacy. But the crown was a glittering illusion. The reality waiting for him back north was brutally different. His power base in West Francia was crumbling. While he was in Rome winning a title, the Vikings were rampaging through his homeland with near impunity. The great nobles whom he had neglected to buy loyalty from were acting as independent princes, building castles and raising private armies. The imperial title gave him no extra soldiers to command, no new taxes to collect outside his own diminished realm. He was an emperor without an empire, a man who had climbed to the highest peak only to find the mountain had eroded beneath his feet. The contrast could not have been more stark. In Rome, he was the anointed sovereign of Christendom. In Paris, he was a king begging his own dukes for military support, forced to pay vast sums of silver to Viking raiders just to make them go away. His imperial coronation was the ultimate symbol of a profound shift. The title had become divorced from any real power. It was now a trophy, a piece of political theater to be claimed by the most cunning or fortunate ruler, not the birthright of someone who actually governed a unified realm. Charles's tragic pursuit shows us that by the late 9th century, rebuilding the empire was no longer a practical goal. It was a prestigious, dangerous fantasy, a dream that could distract a king from the hard work of ruling the kingdom he actually had. The ghost of Charlemagne had not been resurrected. It had merely been hired for a coronation ceremony, and its price was the stability of a nation. The imperial crown Charles won in Rome could not stop the storms from the north. While kings fought over titles and territories, a far more immediate threat was reshaping the very landscape of power, the Viking lordship. These were not just raids, they were a relentless, systemic pressure that exploited the empire's fragmentation and made it permanent. The Vikings did not need to conquer kingdoms to change history. They simply had to ensure no king could ever fully control his own coastlines or rivers again. From the late 8th century onward, their sleek ships appeared with terrifying frequency, probing the rich, undefended monasteries and towns of the Frankish coast. At first, they came for portable wealth, silver, relics, and captives, striking fast and vanishing back to sea. But as the 9th century wore on and the civil wars between Charlemagne's descendants drained royal treasuries and divided royal attention, the Vikings changed their tactics. They realized there was no unified response, no great imperial fleet to challenge them, so they stayed. They began to overwinter on captured islands in the Loire and Seine rivers, turning them into permanent bases for deeper, more audacious campaigns. In the year 845, a Viking fleet of over 100 ships sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris itself. Charles the Bald, the newly crowned king, did not rally a grand army to crush them. He paid them £7,000 of silver to leave. This dangled, this protection money, was a stark admission of royal weakness. It was also a brilliant short-term strategy for the Vikings, who now understood that fragmentation could be monetized. They would return again and again, each time demanding a heavier price. This cycle had a catastrophic effect on royal authority. The king's primary duty was the defense of the realm, and he was failing at it publicly. The flow of silver to the north was a hemorrhage of royal prestige, but the true, lasting impact was not on the king. It was on the local lords who lived in the path of the storm. A count whose lands bordered the Seine could not wait for a royal army that might be months away, or might never come at all because the king was fighting his brother in Lotharingia. Survival demanded local solutions, so these counts and bishops took matters into their own hands. They began constructing private fortresses, not grand palaces, but sturdy, wooden or stone towers on mounds of earth surrounded by palisades. These were the early castles, and they were game changers. a local lord barricaded inside his fortress with his own band of sworn fighters could now defy a Viking warband. More importantly, he could also begin to defy a distant king. The peasants of the surrounding countryside, desperate for protection, would flock to these strongholds, offering their labor and loyalty to the local lord in exchange for safety behind his walls. The lord, in turn, became their judge, their protector, and their only real ruler. He collected his own taxes in the form of food and service, and raised his own army from the men on his lands. Royal authority, which had always flowed down from the emperor through his appointed counts, now evaporated at the castle gate. The count was no longer just the king's administrator, he was becoming a sovereign in miniature. This process, repeated in 1,000 localities across West Francia and beyond, turned political fragmentation into a physical, fortified reality. The map was no longer divided into royal provinces, but into a patchwork of private lordships, each centered on a castle, each governed by a man whose power was built not on a royal charter, but on the simple, brutal fact that he could defend his own. The Viking invasions did not destroy the Carolingian state. It was already crumbling from within. Instead, they acted as a terrible accelerant, forcing a radical decentralization of power for the sake of survival. By making the king irrelevant to daily defense, they ensured that real authority would be built from the ground up, stone by stone, in the courtyards of 1,000 local fortresses. The age of empires was over, the age of the castle had begun. Charles the Bald died in the year 877, crossing the Alps in a desperate attempt to hold onto his Italian gains. His passing was not a dignified end for an emperor, but a frantic journey cut short, a fitting metaphor for his entire reign. He left behind a kingdom, West Francia, where the crown was becoming little more than a ceremonial hat passed between increasingly feeble heads. The dynasty was entering its twilight, a long, slow fade into irrelevance. For the next several decades, a series of Carolingian kings would wear the crown, men with names like Louis the Stammerer, Louis III, and Charlemagne. Their reigns were brief, plagued by illness, and utterly overshadowed by the true powers in the realm, the great territorial lords. These were men like Odo, Count of Paris, who famously defended the city against the Vikings, and the family of Robert the Strong, whose descendants, the Robertians, controlled vast swaths of land around Paris. The kings could no longer command, they could only negotiate, bargaining away royal lands and privileges just to secure the military support of these magnates for a few more months. The royal palace was no longer the center of power. That authority had shifted to the stone keeps of the counts and dukes. In the south, the fragmentation reached its logical conclusion. After the death of the last Carolingian sub-king of Provence, the local nobility did something unthinkable a century earlier. They elected a king who was not a Carolingian. In 879, they chose a powerful duke named Boso. His family, the Bossonids, were connected to the old dynasty by marriage, but he was an outsider, a noble who built his own power base. His coronation as King of Provence was a seismic event, a clear signal that the blood of Charlemagne was no longer a prerequisite for royal title. If a local strongman could be made king by the consent of his peers, then the entire mystical foundation of Carolingian rule, the idea of God-chosen family blood, had evaporated. The final stage of this decay was the era of the phantom kings. In both East and West Francia, the last Carolingians were hollow figures. In the West, Charles the Simple, a child when crowned, spent his long reign as a pawn, shuffled between regents and powerful dukes. His authority a polite fiction everyone agreed to maintain for the sake of order, but no one actually obeyed. The real business of government, justice, defense, and taxation was handled entirely by regional powers like the Dukes of Aquitaine, the Counts of Flanders, and the Robertians in Neustria. In East Francia, the story followed a similar, if slightly delayed, path. The Carolingian line there ended not with a bang, but with a childless king, Louis the Child, who died in the early 10th century. His death created a crisis, but also an opportunity. The great tribal dukes of the East, the Saxons, Bavarians, Swabians, and Franconians, faced with the vacuum and continuing threats from Magyar horsemen to the east, made a pragmatic decision. They did not search for a distant Carolingian cousin. Instead, they elected one of their own, the Duke of Franconia, Conrad, as their king. It was a clean, practical break. The age demanded rulers who could lead armies in person, who understood local loyalties, not distant emperors chasing ghosts. In the West, the final break came in the year 987, when the last Carolingian claimant was passed over, and the nobles elected Hugh Capet, the head of the powerful Robertian family, as king of the Franks. With that election, the Carolingian dynasty, at least as a ruling force, was finished. The great family that had once bestrode Europe like colossi had been reduced to a memory, their power siphoned away first by their own divisions, then by Viking fires, and finally by the iron will of the men who built castles and commanded real loyalty on the ground. The empire was not just divided, it was dissolved, its components now in the hands of a new class of ruler who would forge a different world from the pieces. The city of Paris was burning. In the autumn of 885, a massive Viking fleet returned to the Seine, led by the fearsome chieftain Siegfried. This was no hit-and-run raid. It was a full-scale siege aimed at breaking the last major symbol of royal power in West Francia. For over a year, the Northmen blockaded the river, their warriors assaulting the fortified bridges and walls. Inside the city, hope was dwindling along with the food supplies. The Carolingian king at the time, Charles the Fat, the last man to briefly hold the imperial title over all the fractured kingdoms, was elsewhere, distracted and ineffective. The defense of Paris did not fall to a king, but to its count, a man named Odo or Eudes. He was not of Charlemagne's bloodline, he was a Robertian, the son of the famed Robert the Strong. For 13 grueling months, Odo organized the resistance, rallying the citizens and his own knights in a desperate, street-by-street fight for survival. His leadership was personal, brave, and crucially successful. The Vikings, unable to take the city, eventually accepted a payment and withdrew, but the legend of Odo the Defender was already spreading across the realm. When Charles the Fat died just 3 years later in 888, the kingdom faced a moment of profound decision. There was a legitimate Carolingian heir, a boy of only 8 years old named Charles, who would later be known as Charles the Simple. But the realm was in flames, with Vikings still on the loose and nobles fighting for scraps. The great magnates, the dukes and counts who held real power, gathered in council. They looked at the child claimant, a symbol of a dynasty that had failed to protect them, and they looked at the battle-hardened hero of Paris. Their choice was a matter of survival, not sentiment. They elected Odo as king. This was not a quiet succession, it was a political revolution. For the first time since the dynasty's founding, the crown of West Francia was placed on the head of a man who could not trace his lineage back to Charlemagne. The principle of election, of choosing the most capable leader in a time of crisis, had openly triumphed over the principle of dynastic right, the idea that royal blood alone conveyed a sacred mandate to rule. This created an immediate and catastrophic fracture in the very concept of legitimacy. Who was the true king? Was it Odo, the elected champion chosen by the powerful men of the realm? Or was it the young Charles, the rightful Carolingian whose supporters, led by the powerful Archbishop of Rheims, insisted God's will flowed through bloodline? For the next several years, West Francia had two competing kings, each with their own zone of support, their own courts, and their own claims to legitimacy. This duality paralyzed the kingdom. Nobles could and did switch allegiance based on who offered them the best deal, further eroding any central authority. The conflict was only resolved temporarily when Odo, nearing the end of his life, acknowledged young Charles as his heir, a fragile compromise that papered over the deeper crack. The Odo Interregnum proved that in the face of existential threat, practical necessity could override centuries of tradition. It established a dangerous but powerful precedent: the crown could be won. It was not merely inherited, it could be earned through military prowess and political deal-making. This injected a volatile new element into the political system, for every powerful duke with a strong army and a castle now had a historical example that said, if the situation is dire enough and you are strong enough, you too could be chosen. The ghost of Charlemagne's lineage still haunted the halls of power, but now it had to share space with the living, breathing reality of the man with the strongest sword arm and the most loyal knights. The election of Odo as king was not an accident, but the culmination of a family's relentless rise. While the Carolingian dynasty flickered, another house was building its power from the ground up, stone by stone, castle by castle. This was the family of Robert the Strong, the ancestors of the future Capetian kings of France. Their story is not one of imperial crowns and grand titles, but of gritty local power, the kind that actually mattered in a broken world. Robert the Strong, their patriarch, was appointed by Charles the Bald not as a gesture of trust, but out of sheer necessity. The king needed a hammer in the west to smash Viking raids and keep rebellious nobles in line. Robert was that hammer. He was given the title of Duke of the Franks, a military command over the lands between the Seine and Loire rivers, the very region most exposed to Norse attack. He did not rule this area as a king, he defended it as a warlord, and in doing so he made it his own. He fought the Vikings relentlessly, and though he fell in battle, he died a hero in the eyes of the local population, who saw him as their true protector, not the distant emperor. His sons, Odo and Robert, inherited not just his lands but his reputation and his private army of loyal knights. When Odo was elected king, it was a recognition of this raw military capability. But here is the crucial twist. After Odo's reign ended and the crown returned briefly to the Carolingian Charles the Simple, the family's power did not fade. Instead, it became institutionalized. Robert, Odo's brother, was the next head of the family. He never sought the crown for himself, at least not at first. Instead, he wielded a title that tells us everything about where real authority now resided. He held the position of Duke of the Franks, and later, an even more potent one, Marquis of Neustria. These were not empty honors. They gave him official, royal sanction to be the military overlord of the entire region around Paris, the royal heartland itself. In practice, this meant that while Charles the Simple was called king, Robert controlled the armies, the fortresses, and the loyalty of the local nobility. He was the power behind the throne, the ultimate kingmaker. When Charles the Simple's reign eventually collapsed due to his own missteps and noble discontent, the magnates again turned to the Robertian strongman. In 922, they elected Robert I as king. His reign was short, ending just 2 years later in a battle against a rival faction, but it cemented a monumental truth. The monarchy in West Francia had become a prize that could be claimed by the family that controlled the Isle de France, the rich agricultural basin centered on Paris. The Robertians now possessed something far more valuable than a fleeting crown. They possessed a durable territorial base, a network of fortified strongholds, and a legacy of being the indispensable defenders of the realm. They were the first family of France in everything but name. When the last Carolingian claimant was passed over in 987, the nobles did not choose a stranger or a foreign prince. They chose Hugh Capet, the grandson of Robert I, a man whose family had been stewarding the core of the kingdom for over a century. His election was not a revolution, it was a ratification. The ghost of Charlemagne had finally been exorcised not by a conqueror but by the patient, stubborn accumulation of local power. The age of the empire builder was over. The age of the territorial lord who knew every forest path and every vassal's name had definitively begun. But for one brief, flickering moment, the ghost of empire returned to life. In the year 884, a single man found himself wearing almost every crown of his great-grandfather's fractured realm. That man was Charles, known to history as Charles the Fat. He was the youngest son of Louis the German, and through a grim lottery of family loss, he inherited East Francia, then Italy, and finally, after the death of his cousins, he was accepted as king in West Francia. For the first time since the Treaty of Verdun over 40 years earlier, a single Carolingian ruled from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. On paper, it was a stunning reversal, a miraculous reunification. In reality, it was a hollow echo, a last, desperate gasp of an idea whose time had already passed. Charles was not a conqueror or a reformer. He was simply the last man standing in a dwindling family, inheriting titles but not the power that once accompanied them. His brief reign exposed the brutal truth that holding a title and governing a realm were now two entirely different things. The ultimate test came in 885, when that massive Viking army laid siege to Paris. Count Odo and his citizens fought heroically, but they waited in vain for their newly crowned emperor to arrive with a relief force. Charles the Fat, encamped with a large army nearby, did not attack. Instead, he negotiated. He promised the Vikings a massive payment of silver, 700 pounds of it, and granted them permission to sail up the Seine to raid the rebellious region of Burgundy, which was outside his direct control. To the defenders of Paris, this was not strategy, it was betrayal. The emperor had chosen to buy off a threat to his own subjects, redirecting the violence toward others rather than crushing it. He had failed in the most basic duty of any ruler, protection. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The aura of imperial authority, which had briefly shimmered around Charles, evaporated overnight. If the emperor could not, or would not, defend the very heart of the old empire, then what was the point of his grand title? His weakness was a signal to every powerful duke and count that they were truly on their own. Just 2 years later, in 887, Charles was deposed, stricken by illness and abandoned by the nobility who saw him as utterly ineffective. He was forced to convene an assembly where he was formally stripped of his crown. He died in obscurity a few weeks later. This was not just the end of a king, it was the end of an idea. The deposition of Charles the Fat proved, once and for all, that a reunited Carolingian empire was a political fantasy. Unity had required more than just bloodline, it required strength, will, and the loyalty of warriors, none of which Charles possessed. His failure cemented the permanence of the divisions carved at Verdun and Prüm. From that point forward, no one would seriously attempt to glue all the pieces back together. The energy of the age flowed into strengthening the separate kingdoms that had emerged, building new loyalties around local heroes like Odo, and forging new identities within borders that were finally becoming real. The ghost had made its final appearance, and everyone had seen it for the illusion it was. Italy became the stage where the imperial dream turned into a local prize. Far from the Rhine and the memories of Ottoman, the title of emperor was no longer about uniting Europe. It was about controlling the Alpine passes and the city of Rome. Two men, neither with a drop of Carolingian blood, now fought for the hollow crown. In the north, based in the fortress city of Verona, was Berengar, the Margrave of Friuli. He was a grandson of Charlemagne through a daughter, a distant echo of the old bloodline, but his power was purely regional, built on his loyal Friulian knights and his strategic lands guarding the eastern approaches to Italy. His rival was the formidable Guy, Duke of Spoleto, who ruled the central duchies with an iron fist. Guy was a pure warlord, a man whose authority came from his sword and his network of loyal vassals in the hilltop fortresses south of Rome. The symbol they fought over was the Iron Crown of Lombardy, the ancient circlet said to contain a nail from the true cross, which made one the King of Italy. But the greater prize dangled by a desperate papacy was the imperial coronation itself. The Pope, threatened by local Roman factions, needed a strong military protector. He would bestow the title of emperor on whichever strongman could march to Rome and secure his position. So the empire became a transaction. In 889, Guy of Spoleto forced the issue. He marched his army north, met Berengar's forces at the river Trebbia, and won a decisive victory. With his rival temporarily subdued, Guy turned south to Rome, where Pope Stephen V, seeing no other option, anointed him emperor. But this was not a restoration, it was a hire. Guy was the Pope's hired sword, an emperor whose realm was effectively the Papal States and his own duchies. Berengar, however, was not finished. He retreated, rebuilt his strength, and waited. A few years later, when Guy's attention was elsewhere, Berengar struck back, defeating Guy in battle and forcing a bizarre compromise. The chronicles describe a treaty where they simply agreed to split the Kingdom of Italy between them, a microcosm of the Verdun division played out on a smaller, more violent scale. Guy kept the imperial title and the West, Berengar kept the East and the Iron Crown. This absurd arrangement lasted only until Guy's death, after which Berengar finally claimed the imperial title for himself. The spectacle of Guy and Berengar reveals the complete transformation of the imperial idea. It was now a tool in Italian power politics, a badge used by regional dukes to legitimize local rule and gain an edge over their closest rival. No one in Paris or Frankfurt considered these men their overlord. The empire had shrunk from a continent to a peninsula, and from a peninsula to the bargaining chip between two warlords. When the crown could be won by the victor of a single battle and bought with a promise of protection to a pope, its ancient majesty was gone. The ghost of Charlemagne was not walking the halls of Europe anymore. It was haunting the back alleys of Roman politics, a phantom for sale to the highest bidder. The political map of Europe around the year 900 would have looked like a shattered mosaic. Gone was the grand, unified design of Charlemagne's empire, replaced by a bewildering array of small, competing states, each a fragment of the former whole. In the very center of the continent, where the old Middle Kingdom had once been, the process of splintering reached its zenith. The rich lands of Burgundy, for instance, were not one kingdom but two. To the north, nestled between the West Frankish realm and the Alps, lay the kingdom of Upper Burgundy, ruled by a Carolingian descendant. To the south, along the Rhone River and the Mediterranean coast, was the kingdom of Lower Burgundy, often called Provence, which had already elected its own non-Carolingian king. These were not allies but rival siblings, each with its own court, its own ambitions, and its own local nobility whose loyalty stopped firmly at the border. Further south, the Kingdom of Italy was a prize fought over by the warlords of Friuli and Spoleto, its crown a trophy in a never-ending local conflict. To the east, the Duchy of Bavaria was essentially an independent state, its duke often more powerful than the East Frankish king who nominally ruled him. Across the Rhine, in Saxony, Swabia, and Franconia, similar powerful duchies were forming, their leaders speaking for their people in a way a distant emperor never could. If you were to look at a map from this time, you would not see the clean, bold lines of modern nations. You would see a patchwork of colors, a kaleidoscope of territories that seemed to shift with every marriage, battle, and inheritance. A traveler journeying from Paris to Rome would not pass through one or two kingdoms, but through a dozen, each with its own customs, its own tolls, and its own armed men demanding to know your business. There was no central post office, no imperial highway patrol, no single set of laws that applied from one valley to the next. Authority was local, hyper-local, rooted in the castle on the hill that controlled the river crossing or the mountain pass. This was the ultimate result of a century of fragmentation. It was not just that the empire had broken into 3 pieces at Verdun. It was that those 3 pieces had themselves shattered into dozens of shards, and those shards had then cracked again. The process was like watching a pane of glass slowly disintegrate under repeated blows. First the large cracks, then the pieces break apart, and finally you are left with a pile of glittering, sharp fragments, impossible to reassemble into the original window. This extreme decentralization meant there was no central authority left to rebuild from, no single power strong enough to even attempt a reunification. The very idea of an empire had become meaningless on the ground. A duke in Bavaria looked to his own interests and his immediate neighbors, not to the ghost of an emperor in Italy or a weakened king in Francia. The political energy of the age was now flowing in the opposite direction, inward and downward, into consolidating these small, regional power bases. Lords were fortifying their own manors, counts were tightening their grip on their counties, and dukes were forging their disparate tribes into coherent duchies. They were building the foundations for the next era, the feudal age, where loyalty was personal, local, and sealed by oaths between a man and his immediate lord. The dream of a unified Europe was not just dormant, it was buried under the practical, daily reality of 1,000 local sovereignties. To ask who could rebuild the empire now was to ask the wrong question. The real question was what new world would be built from these countless independent pieces. While the West was a mosaic of lordships, a different kind of consolidation was beginning in the forests east of the Rhine. Here in East Francia, the end of the Carolingian line created not chaos, but an opportunity for a new kind of kingdom to be forged, one built not on imperial nostalgia, but on hard military necessity. The Carolingian dynasty there ended with a child, Louis the Child, who died in the year 911, leaving no heir. The great tribal territories of the realm, known as the stem duchies, now faced a vacuum. These were not small counties, but powerful, ancient regions: Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia, each with its own duke, its own laws, and its own fierce sense of identity. They were also facing a terrifying new enemy from the east, the Magyar horsemen, lightning-fast raiders from the Hungarian plains who swept in to plunder with devastating efficiency. The old model of a distant emperor was useless against this threat. The dukes needed a leader, not a figurehead. In the year 919, they made a pragmatic, revolutionary choice. They bypassed any distant Carolingian cousins and elected one of their own as king, Henry, the Duke of Saxony. He would be remembered as Henry the Fowler, a name from a legend that he was found fixing birding nets when messengers came to tell him of his election, a story that hints at his reputation as a practical, hands-on ruler, not a palace prince. His election was a clean break with the past, a declaration that leadership would now be earned by capability, not merely inherited by blood. Henry understood his mandate perfectly. He was not chosen to rebuild an empire, but to defend a homeland. His first, crucial act was a stunning display of political realism. When the Duke of Bavaria refused to acknowledge him, Henry did not immediately march to war. Instead, he marched to the Bavarian border, not with a full army, but with a show of force strong enough to make negotiation the smarter option. He secured the Duke's nominal submission, but more importantly, he secured a promise of military aid against the Magyars. This set the tone for his entire reign. He would treat the stem dukes not as subjects to be crushed, but as partners in a common defense, provided they acknowledged his royal authority in matters of war and peace. To build a true power base, however, Henry needed his own source of wealth and warriors, independent of the sometimes fickle dukes. He found this not in the old Carolingian heartlands, but by looking eastward across the Elbe River. He turned his attention to the Slavic tribes like the Wends and the Abodrites, who inhabited the lands beyond the Saxon frontier. He launched a series of campaigns not for annihilation but for subjugation and tribute. He forced these tribes to acknowledge his overlordship and to pay an annual tax, a flow of silver and goods that went directly into the royal treasury. He also began a program of building fortified settlements called burgwards in these border zones. These were not just military outposts, they were centers of administration and colonization, places where Saxon settlers could live under royal protection and slowly extend Frankish culture and control. This eastern policy was a masterstroke. It provided Henry with the resources to reward his own loyal followers, creating a new class of nobility directly tied to the crown. It gave his restless Saxon warriors a common purpose and a frontier to expand into, channeling their energy outward rather than letting it fuel internal squabbles. And it created a buffer zone against the Magyars. By the time the Magyar raids reached their peak in the early 930s, Henry had spent a decade strengthening his kingdom. His preparation was put to the ultimate test. In 933, a massive Magyar force invaded Saxony. Henry met them at the Battle of Ried. Using a combination of fortified infantry and disciplined cavalry tactics he had developed specifically to counter the Magyars' mobile style, he won a decisive, stunning victory. For the first time in decades, the seemingly invincible raiders were thrown back in defeat. The victory at Ried did more than secure a border, it forged a legend. It proved that Henry's model of kingship, based on defense, integration, and eastward expansion, worked. He had taken a collection of disparate, inward-looking duchies and given them a shared victory and a shared future. He laid a new foundation, one made of stone fortresses, tribute silver, and the hard-earned loyalty of men who had seen their king lead them to safety. When Henry the Fowler passed the crown to his son, Otto, in 936, he did not pass on the ghost of an empire. He passed on a functioning, defended, and ambitious kingdom, ready to step onto a very different European stage. Otto inherited not just a crown from his father, but a blueprint for power. Henry the Fowler had built a kingdom that could defend itself, but his son, Otto the Great, would transform it into something that could dominate its neighbors. His reign would become the pivotal moment when the ghost of empire was not just summoned, but recast in an entirely new form, one centered firmly on German lands and German kings. The first great test of his vision came from the east, from the same Magyar horsemen his father had defeated. In the summer of 955, a huge Magyar army, perhaps the largest ever assembled for a raid, swept into the Duchy of Bavaria. They plundered with impunity, then turned for home, laden with loot and captives. Otto, however, was waiting. He had spent years consolidating his authority, sometimes brutally, over the rebellious stem dukes, ensuring that this time the entire military might of the German kingdom would answer his call. He intercepted the Magyar force on the Lech River plain near the city of Augsburg. The Battle of Lechfeld was not a skirmish, it was a meticulously planned annihilation. Otto deployed his heavy cavalry, armored knights sworn directly to him, in a series of disciplined charges that shattered the Magyars' mobile formations. He then used his infantry to block their escape routes. The Magyar army was surrounded and destroyed. The victory was so total, so devastating, that the Magyar raids into Central Europe ceased almost overnight. The threat that had defined the early 10th century was extinguished in a single day. For Otto, Lechfeld was more than a military triumph. It was a political revelation. He had proven that a strong, central monarch, commanding the direct loyalty of a warrior elite, could achieve what a fragmented collection of dukes could not. He was no longer merely first among equals, he was the undisputed savior of Christendom. The victory bestowed upon him a sacred aura, a sense that he was God's chosen instrument. This divine mandate would now point his ambitions south across the Alps. Italy, as always, was in chaos. Local magnates fought over the Iron Crown, and the papacy was caught in a spiral of corruption and violence. When Pope John XII, a young man embroiled in Roman factional strife, faced a rebellion, he sent a desperate appeal to the northern hero who had crushed the pagans. For Otto, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Crossing the Alps with his veteran army in 961, he entered Italy not as a conqueror, but as a papal invited protector. He quickly pacified the rebellious nobles, confirmed the Pope's authority, and in a solemn ceremony in Rome on the 2nd of February, 962, Pope John XII placed the imperial crown on his head. Otto the Great was now Holy Roman Emperor, but we must look past the ceremonial echo of Charlemagne. This was not a restoration. Charlemagne's empire had been a Frankish project, administered from Aachen and focused on the Rhineland. Otto's empire was a Saxon creation, and its heart beat in the German stem duchies and the eastern marches. Its structure was fundamentally different. Otto did not dream of reviving a universal Christian empire from the North Sea to Spain. His new empire was a German kingdom with an Italian appendix, held together by a powerful, hands-on monarchy and a revolutionary new alliance with the Church. He implemented what historians call the Ottoman System. To counter the power of the tribal dukes who had plagued his father, Otto turned the bishops and abbots of the realm into pillars of the state. He appointed them himself, granting them vast tracts of land and the rights to collect taxes and raise soldiers from those lands. In return, these prince-bishops and abbots provided the emperor with educated administrators, loyal troops, and a network of authority that bypassed the secular nobility. A bishop owed his position entirely to the emperor, not to an inherited family claim, making him a far more reliable agent of royal will. This church-state fusion became the empire's administrative backbone. Furthermore, Otto's imperial title gave him formal sovereignty over Italy, which meant control of the wealthy northern cities and, crucially, the ability to influence papal elections. The empire was now a dual monarchy, a German king who was also the protector of Rome. The crown he wore was the same title Charlemagne had held, but the political entity it represented was narrower, more institutional, and explicitly centered on the German nation. Otto the Great did not rebuild Charlemagne's empire. He built something new from its broken pieces, a hybrid kingdom that would endure, in one form or another, for nearly 1,000 years. He had finally given the restless ghost a permanent and distinctly German home. Otto's crown may have looked like Charlemagne's, but the empire it represented was built on a fundamentally different blueprint. Charlemagne's realm was a vast personal dominion, its unity flowing directly from his own charismatic command over a warrior aristocracy. Otto's creation was something more systematic, a political machine designed to operate in a world where such personal loyalty could no longer be assumed. His model accepted the hard truth of fragmentation and sought not to erase it, but to master it through three ingenious, interlocking strategies. The first and most revolutionary was his transformation of the German Church into the arm of the state, a system later called the Reichskirchen system. Otto and his successors appointed bishops and abbots not just as spiritual leaders but as royal governors. He granted them counties, the right to mint coins, and the authority to raise troops from their church lands. In return, these prince-bishops owed their power and wealth entirely to the emperor, not to any local noble family. This created a loyal administrative class spread across the kingdom, men who provided the crown with educated clerks, reliable soldiers, and a counterweight to the ambitions of the secular dukes. A bishop in Saxony or Franconia became, in essence, the emperor's permanent regional lieutenant, governing with a quill and a cross where a count might govern only with a sword. The second pillar of the Ottoman system was blood. Where Charlemagne had relied on appointed counts, Otto installed his own family as the linchpins of his power. He made his brother Bruno the Archbishop of Cologne and Duke of Lorraine, fusing ecclesiastical and military authority in the hands of a man he could trust absolutely. He married his son, the future Otto II, to a Byzantine princess, weaving a thread of ancient imperial legitimacy into the family line. His daughters were placed as abbesses in powerful convents, turning these religious houses into extensions of the royal court. The empire was to be a family business with trusted relatives governing key territories, ensuring that loyalty would not be an abstract concept, but a matter of direct kinship and shared destiny. This was a deliberate move to prevent the kind of fratricidal wars that had shattered the Carolingian inheritance. Finally, there was Italy. For Otto, control of the peninsula and the imperial coronation in Rome were not nostalgic goals, they were essential tools for legitimacy. The title of Holy Roman Emperor conferred by the Pope lifted the German king above all other regional rulers in Western Christendom. It gave him a sacred aura and a formal claim to intervene in Italian affairs. This was crucial because Italy was the wealthiest part of the old Carolingian Middle Kingdom, its northern cities buzzing with trade. By securing the Iron Crown of Lombardy and the imperial diadem, Otto channeled Italian wealth and prestige northward to reinforce his German power base. Yet this was not a bid to reunite the entire old empire. Otto had no real interest in the fractured kingdoms of West Francia, which were becoming France. His focus was firmly on the German-Italian axis. His model accepted that the western third of Charlemagne's realm was forever lost. Instead of trying to glue all the old pieces back together, he took the two largest, most valuable fragments he could reliably control, Germany and Italy, and bound them into a new, durable union. His empire was a pragmatic federation, not a universal monarchy. It was designed to manage perpetual fragmentation by creating a strong center, held by his family and the church, that could keep the powerful pieces in orbit. He rebuilt an empire not by reversing the tide of history, but by learning to sail with it. Otto the Great's brilliant system had one glaring, familiar flaw. It depended entirely on the strength and longevity of the emperor himself. The moment a child inherited the throne, the entire carefully balanced structure would tremble, and the old specter of fragmentation would rise from its shallow grave. This is precisely what happened, not once but repeatedly, proving that no political innovation could fully solve the ancient, biological lottery of dynastic succession. The crisis began almost immediately after Otto's death in 973. His son, Otto II, was a grown man, but his reign would be cut tragically short by a single, catastrophic military defeat. In 982, seeking to expand his control in southern Italy, he led his army against the forces of the Muslim Emirate of Sicily. At the Battle of Stilo, in the scorching Calabrian sun, his heavily armored German knights were outmaneuvered and slaughtered. Otto himself barely escaped with his life, swimming to a Byzantine ship offshore. The defeat was a shattering blow to the imperial mystique. The invincible aura his father had built at Lechfeld evaporated in the Mediterranean heat. Otto returned to Germany humiliated, his treasury drained, and his authority among the Saxon nobility critically weakened. He died just a year later, in 983, leaving as his heir a 3-year-old boy, his son Otto III. The empire now belonged to an infant. A regency was formed, led by the child's mother, the Byzantine Princess Theophanu, and his grandmother, the formidable Adelaide. These women were capable and intelligent rulers, but they operated from a position of inherent political weakness. They could not lead armies in person, the ultimate source of respect in that warrior society. They had to govern through persuasion, alliance, and the distribution of favors to powerful dukes and bishops. This was the moment the great aristocratic families, temporarily subdued by Otto the Great, saw their opening. In Saxony, the Billung family, entrusted with defending the northern frontier, began to act more like independent princes, treating their march as a hereditary possession. In Bavaria, the rebellious Duke Henry the Quarrelsome saw the regency as a chance to reclaim his autonomy and even make a bid for the throne itself. The central authority, painstakingly built by the first Otto, began to leak away to the peripheries as regional strongmen tested the limits of a government run from a nursery. When Otto III finally came of age, he was a fascinating, complex figure, steeped in the grandeur of his imperial title, but physically detached from the German power base that sustained it. He dreamed not of managing dukes, but of reviving the Roman Empire in its ancient spiritual form, with himself as a philosopher-emperor ruling from Rome itself. He built a palace on the Aventine Hill and surrounded himself with intellectuals and clerics, including the future Pope Sylvester II. His vision was breathtaking, but it was also profoundly alien to the Saxon warriors and German bishops whose support he needed. By focusing on Italy and imperial theology, he neglected the gritty, daily work of maintaining alliances and military presence in Germany. The result was a growing disconnect. When Otto III died suddenly of illness in the year 1002, at just 21 years old, he left no heir. The Saxon line of Otto the Great was extinct. Once again, the empire faced a succession crisis. The nobles and bishops gathered, and after some debate, they chose a distant relative, Henry II, the Duke of Bavaria. He was a capable ruler, but his election was a stark reminder that the throne was not yet fully hereditary. It was still a prize that could be contested when the direct line failed. The reigns of Otto II and Otto III, sandwiched around a long regency, demonstrated a brutal cycle. A strong emperor like Otto I could impose his will and create a system. A weak ruler, whether due to defeat, youth, or a dreamy disposition, created a vacuum, and into that vacuum flowed the relentless, centripetal force of aristocratic ambition and regional identity. The Ottoman system had not eliminated the Carolingian problem of succession. It had merely built a sturdier stage upon which the same old family drama would play out, again and again, for centuries to come. The final act in the long decline of the Carolingians in the West was not a battle, but a quiet election. In the year 987, the great nobles and bishops of what we now call France gathered at the city of Senlis. They faced a choice that would define the next millennium. On one side stood Charles of Lorraine, the last legitimate Carolingian heir, the uncle of the recently deceased young king. His bloodline was impeccable, tracing straight back to Charlemagne himself. On the other stood Hugh Capet, the Duke of the Franks, head of the Robertian family that had been the real power behind the throne for over a century. The decision they made was a cold calculation of political reality. Charles was seen as an outsider, too connected to the affairs of the German court and the old Middle Kingdom. More damningly, he lacked a strong local power base of his own within West Francia. Hugh Capet, in contrast, was one of them. He controlled the crucial region of Neustria, the lands around Paris and Orleans, from a web of loyal castles and vassals. He was the man who could keep order, who could defend against the remnants of Viking raids and the ambitions of other powerful dukes. The nobles chose the strongman over the symbol. They elected Hugh Capet as king of the Franks. With that vote, the Carolingian dynasty, after nearly 2.5 centuries of rule, was peacefully and permanently set aside. It was a revolution wrapped in the formal robes of an assembly, the ultimate triumph of practical power over dynastic mystique. But Hugh's crown, though shiny, was almost laughably small in terms of real territory. The royal domain, the land he owned and governed directly as his personal property, was a tiny patchwork. It consisted of scattered estates around Paris and Orleans, a few towns along the Seine and Loire rivers, and little more. To travel from one royal castle to another, he would have to pass through the lands of counts and dukes who were, for all practical purposes, his equals or even superiors in wealth and military strength. The Dukes of Normandy, who ruled a powerful Viking-settled state on the Channel coast, answered to no one. The Counts of Flanders in the north and the Dukes of Aquitaine in the sunny south were virtually independent sovereigns. The Count of Barcelona looked south to the Mediterranean, not north to Paris. Hugh Capet was king in name, but his actual authority stopped at the edge of his own modest vineyards and fields. This was the extreme endpoint of fragmentation, a kingdom where the monarch was merely the first among a council of warlords, his title a recognition of prestige rather than a command of obedience. The Capetian coup did not reunite Francia, it simply placed a new family at the apex of its fractured landscape, giving them the daunting, centuries-long task of trying to piece it back together, one loyal vassal and one strategic marriage at a time. Two royal families now faced the same daunting puzzle with entirely different toolkits. The Capetian kings in the west and the Ottoman emperors in the east each inherited a landscape of fragments, but their strategies for building something lasting from the rubble could not have been more distinct. Their contrasting approaches would forge two very different Europes. The Capetian game was one of patient, relentless aggression. Starting with Hugh Capet's tiny royal domain, a modest collection of lands around Paris and Orleans, they played a long generational game. Their primary weapon was not the sword but the charter, the marriage contract, and the strategic inheritance. When a great lord died without a clear heir, the Capetian king was there, as the ultimate feudal overlord, to step in and reclaim the territory for the royal domain. They married their sons and daughters into the great ducal families, not for immediate power, but to place a Capetian heir in the line of succession for places like Burgundy or Champagne, decades down the line. They fortified their own core lands, building a network of loyal towns and castles directly answerable to the crown, creating a solid nucleus of power and wealth from which they could slowly exert pressure on their mighty vassals. It was a strategy of inches, a slow seep of royal authority that took centuries, but it had a singular, powerful focus, the steady, physical growth of the king's own land. Across the Rhine, the Ottoman strategy was one of brilliant, complex overlay. The German kings started with a much larger realm, the collection of powerful stem duchies like Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia. They could not hope to absorb these ancient, fiercely independent territories into a small royal domain. Instead, they built a system of control on top of them. Their masterstroke was the alliance with the Church, by appointing loyal bishops and abbots as princes of the empire, granting them lands and military authority. They created a parallel power structure that answered directly to the emperor, bypassing the secular dukes. The emperor became the great patron and protector of the German Church, and in return, the Church provided him with administration, soldiers, and a moral authority that transcended regional loyalties. This was not about expanding a royal domain. It was about weaving a web of loyalty that could hold the disparate pieces of Germany and later Italy together under a single, sacred imperial title. Neither family was trying to resurrect Charlemagne's ghost. The Capetians were building a nation-state piece by piece from the ground up. Their goal was a unified kingdom of France where royal law ran from the center to every border. The Ottonians were constructing a supranational empire, a federation of German and Italian territories held together by the personal authority of a crowned emperor and his network of ecclesiastical allies. One strategy was centripetal, pulling everything inward toward Paris. The other was federal, balancing powerful members under a symbolic crown. The Capetian path led, however slowly, to the modern nation. The Ottoman path led to the Holy Roman Empire, a magnificent, thousand-year-long experiment in managing diversity, but one that would forever struggle with the very centrifugal forces its system was designed to contain. The true legacy of this age lies not in the names of kings, but in the quiet transformation of daily life. Across the 10th and 11th centuries, a profound societal shift occurred, one so deep that historians often call it the Feudal Revolution. This was not a single event but a slow, seismic change in how power was organized from the ground up. It began with a simple, terrifying necessity: defense. As royal authority receded like a tide, local lords faced the relentless pressure of Viking, Magyar, and Saracen raids, not to mention the violence of rival lords next door. They could not wait for a distant king's permission to build a fortress, so they did it themselves using local timber and stone, constructing motte and bailey castles on strategic hills and river bends. These were not the grand stone citadels of later legend, but practical, often hurried strongholds. Their proliferation was astonishing. By the year 1000, thousands dotted the landscape of West Francia alone. Each castle was a statement, a declaration that protection and justice were now local commodities provided by the lord who owned the walls. This was the privatization of power. Public authority, once vested in the king's appointed count, dissolved and was reconstituted as private lordship. The lord in his castle collected his own taxes, which he called dues, in the form of grain, labor, or military service from the peasants who lived on his land. He held his own court, settling disputes among his dependents according to local custom, not a universal royal law. Most critically, he commanded his own military force, a small band of household knights who were bound to him by a deeply personal oath of loyalty for food, shelter, and a share of the plunder. Warfare itself shrank in scale but increased in frequency. Conflicts were no longer about grand imperial campaigns, but about controlling the next valley, seizing a rival's harvest, or avenging a slight to a lord's honor. These were private wars fought between knights who served a man, not a nation. This hyper-localization of life made the dream of a top-down empire like Charlemagne is not just difficult, but structurally impossible. Think of it like this: Charlemagne's system was a single, giant tree, with all the branches drawing sustenance from one central trunk, his personal authority. The Feudal Revolution was like that tree being struck by lightning and shattering into 1,000 splinters, each of which then took root and grew into its own independent sapling. You could not glue the splinters back into the original tree. They were now living, growing entities themselves. A would-be emperor could no longer simply appoint a count and expect obedience. He would have to negotiate with each of these rooted lords individually, bargaining for their support with gifts of land or privileges, knowing their primary loyalty was to their own castle and their own men. The revolution had moved the center of gravity from the palace to the parish, from the emperor to the knight in his manor. Any future unity would have to be built by acknowledging this new, fractured reality, not by commanding it to disappear. The emperor's most powerful weapon was not a sword, but a bishop's crozier. In the face of a nobility whose power was rooted in ancestral lands and family castles, the Ottoman and Salian emperors engineered a brilliant structural counterweight, a loyal elite drawn not from the warrior class but from the clergy. This system, known to historians as the Reichskirchensystem or the Imperial Church system, was a masterstroke of political engineering. It turned the church into the primary administrative arm of the state, creating a novel and durable answer to the century-old problem of fragmentation. Imagine a kingdom where the most reliable governors, tax collectors, and military commanders were not independent dukes, but bishops and abbots appointed directly by the crown. These men were chosen for their loyalty and administrative skill, often plucked from the royal chapel or from humble backgrounds, making them entirely dependent on the emperor's favor for their prestigious position. In a solemn ceremony called investiture, the emperor would hand the new bishop his symbols of office, the ring and the staff, representing his spiritual authority. But the real transaction was what came next. The emperor would also grant the bishop a vast tract of land, a county or duchy, along with all the secular rights that came with it, the right to hold courts, collect tolls, mint coins, and most importantly, to raise soldiers from that territory. This transformed the bishop into a prince-bishop, a hybrid figure who was both a spiritual shepherd and a temporal lord. He now commanded knights, governed peasants, and presided over a court of law, all while answering directly to the emperor who had placed him there. This created a network of powerful agents spread strategically across the realm, in Saxony, Franconia, along the Rhine. A prince-bishop in Cologne or Mainz was not tempted to rebel to make his son his heir, for he had no legitimate children. His power died with him, and his successor would again be chosen by the emperor. This broke the cycle of hereditary entrenchment that had crippled the Carolingians. The system provided the crown with a steady flow of educated, literate administrators who could manage complex legal and financial records, something many rough-edged secular nobles could not do. It provided a reliable source of troops and revenue, as the church lands owed their military service directly to the emperor, not to any intermediate duke. And it created a moral and ideological framework for imperial rule, as these high churchmen preached the divine right of the emperor and the sacred unity of the realm from their pulpits. They became the empire's nervous system, carrying the emperor's will to every diocese. This was not a temporary fix, but a deep structural integration. The imperial chapel school became a training ground for future bishops, ensuring a steady pipeline of loyal and capable men. Major church synods doubled as imperial assemblies, where political and religious policy were forged together. The system acknowledged that the old, purely personal loyalty to a charismatic war leader was gone. In its place, the emperors built an institutional loyalty, one cemented by mutual benefit and sacred duty. The church gained protection, wealth, and a leading role in governing Christendom. The emperor gained a standing army of the faithful, an administrative corps, and a powerful ideological shield against the ambitions of his secular rivals. It was a fragile, brilliant equilibrium, a way to rule a fragmented landscape by weaving a golden thread of sacred authority through its most powerful institutions. The golden thread of the imperial church system contained a hidden flaw, a tension that would unravel the very fabric of Otto's creation. The emperor's practice of personally handing a bishop his ring and staff, symbols of spiritual office, rested on a dangerous assumption that the papacy would forever accept this lay control over the church's most sacred appointments. For over a century this partnership held, but by the late 11th century, a new and revolutionary spirit swept through Rome, one that saw this arrangement not as a practical alliance, but as a sinful corruption. The resulting conflict, known as the Investiture Controversy, would shatter the Ottoman equilibrium and prove that the empire's internal fractures had never truly healed. The spark came from an unlikely source, a monastery in Burgundy called Cluny. From this spiritual powerhouse, a movement grew demanding the purification of the church, freeing it from the grip of worldly lords who bought and sold ecclesiastical offices, a practice called simony. This reformist fervor reached its peak with the election of Pope Gregory VII in the year 1073. Gregory was a man of iron conviction, believing that spiritual authority vested in the papacy was supreme over all earthly power, including that of emperors. He issued a stunning decree banning lay investiture, the ceremony where kings and emperors gave bishops their symbols of office. In Gregory's view, only the church could appoint its own shepherds. The emperor's role was merely to provide temporal protection. This was a direct, existential attack on the foundation of the German emperor's power. If he could no longer appoint his own bishops, he lost his most loyal administrators, his richest sources of revenue, and a significant portion of his army. The entire Reichskirchen system, the ingenious machine that held the empire together, was threatened with shutdown. The emperor at the time, Henry IV, saw Gregory's decree not as a theological debate but as a coup attempt. His response was furious and immediate. He declared the Pope a false monk and demanded he step down. Pope Gregory's retaliation was even more devastating. He excommunicated Henry, cutting him off from the sacraments of the Church and, more importantly, releasing all of Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him. This was the spiritual nuclear option, and it worked with terrifying speed. The German princes, those secular dukes who had always chafed under the emperor's and his bishop's authority, saw their golden opportunity. Faced with a ruler now branded a spiritual outlaw, many rebelled, threatening to elect a new king. Henry found himself isolated, his political support evaporating overnight. To save his throne, he was forced into the most humiliating act of the age. In the bitter winter of 1077, Henry, with his wife and infant son, crossed the Alps into Italy. He sought out the Pope, who was staying at the remote castle of Canossa. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle gates, dressed in the rough wool of a penitent, begging for forgiveness. It was a breathtaking spectacle of political theater, the most powerful man in the secular world brought to his knees by spiritual authority. Gregory, after making him wait, finally absolved him. The immediate crisis was over, but the damage was permanent. Canossa was not a resolution, it was a revelation. It showed every duke and count in Germany that the emperor's power had a limit, and that limit was set in Rome. The imperial crown's sacred aura was tarnished. The controversy dragged on for decades through Henry and Gregory's successors, a grueling war of propaganda and intermittent real warfare. A final compromise, the Concordat of Worms in the year 1122, drew a technical distinction. The emperor could grant a bishop the symbols of his temporal authority, the lands and rights, but only a church official could invest him with the spiritual symbols, the ring and staff. This was a face-saving legal fiction, but its real-world effect was a massive shift in power. The papacy had won a monumental victory, establishing its independence from imperial control. Within the empire, however, the true winners were not in Rome but in the German heartlands. The long decades of conflict between emperor and pope had given the secular princes exactly what they wanted: space. While the emperor was distracted, fighting for his right to appoint bishops, the dukes of Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia were consolidating their own territories, making their own local alliances, and building their own hereditary power bases. They learned they could play the emperor and the pope against each other, pledging support to whichever side weakened the central throne. The Investiture Controversy fatally weakened the very institution, the imperial church, that had been designed to keep them in check. Future emperors would find their bishops less reliable as they now looked to Rome as well as to the royal court for direction. The struggle demonstrated a brutal continuity. The old Carolingian dilemma, the tension between a centralizing crown and powerful local magnates, had not been solved by the Ottoman system. It had merely been managed in a new form. The controversy transformed that management system into a battleground, and in the ensuing fight, the center lost ground. The emperor's authority, which Otto the Great had built on a fusion of church and state, was now divided, contested, and conditional. The ghost of fragmentation, which the Ottoman Empire was supposed to have laid to rest, had been reawakened not by external Vikings, but by an internal war over the soul of authority itself. It proved that any system, no matter how brilliant, remained vulnerable to the oldest forces in politics, ambition, and the thirst for autonomy. The roads from Canossa led in two very different directions. In the west, the Capetian kings of France began a patient, centuries-long project of gathering power back toward the center, thread by thread. In the east, the German emperors found themselves on a path of endless negotiation and compromise, where the very act of ruling strengthened the hands of their rivals. This divergence would create two distinct political landscapes in the heart of Europe. The French crown, starting from its tiny domain around Paris, possessed a singular advantage, a clear and unchallenged dynastic line. For over 300 years, from Hugh Capet onward, every king produced a male heir. This simple fact of biology prevented the succession crises that had shattered the Carolingians and now plagued the Germans. It gave the Capetians the most precious resource of all, time. They used it not for dramatic conquest, but for quiet, legalistic accumulation. When a great feudal lord like the Duke of Aquitaine or the Count of Champagne died without a direct heir, the king, as the ultimate feudal overlord, was there to reclaim the territory for the royal domain. This process, called droit de regale, was a slow drip of land and authority back to the crown. King Philip Augustus in the early 13th century masterfully exploited this. When King John of England, who was also the Duke of Normandy, failed in his feudal duties, Philip had him legally condemned in his own court, the Parlement de Paris, and seized his vast French lands. This was not merely a military victory, it was a judicial one, enforcing the idea that the king's court was the highest authority in the realm. The Capetians also cultivated a powerful new ideology, the idea of the king's sacred, healing touch. They promoted the belief that the French monarch, anointed with holy oil, could cure scrofula, a skin disease, with his touch. This divine mystique set the king apart, making him more than just the greatest feudal lord. He was a semi-sacred figure whose authority came from God, not from a contract with his vassals. Over generations, this combination of stable succession, legal cunning, and sacred aura allowed the French monarchy to slowly but inexorably subdue its princes, turning independent dukes into courtiers in Paris. The kingdom was being woven back together with royal law as the loom. In Germany, the story unfolded in reverse. The Investiture Controversy had opened a wound that never fully healed. The compromise at Worms may have ended the formal battle with the Pope, but it left the German princes stronger than ever. They had tasted power during the decades when the emperor was distracted, and they had no intention of giving it back. The great noble families like the Welfs and the Hohenstaufens now saw the imperial crown not as a sacred trust, but as a prize to be won, an office to be bargained for. When an emperor died, the leading princes, an electoral college in the making, would gather to choose his successor. This was not a mere formality, it was a high-stakes auction. To secure their votes, a candidate had to sign away royal rights and lands, promising not to build castles in a prince's territory, or to grant new tolling rights, or to interfere in local justice. Each election weakened the crown's resources and strengthened the principalities. The great emperors of the 12th and 13th centuries, brilliant men like Frederick Barbarossa, spent their reigns not consolidating a central state, but engaged in a perpetual, exhausting balancing act. They needed the prince's military support for their grand Italian campaigns to uphold the imperial title, but every campaign left them further indebted to those very princes. To fund their ambitions and secure loyalty, they were forced to grant away more and more of the crown's remaining direct authority. They made deals elevating counts to dukes, granting bishops the status of prince-bishops with full sovereign rights, and turning royal castles over to local lords. It was a vicious cycle. The more the emperor sought to project power abroad, the more he had to dismantle his power at home. This process reached its logical conclusion with the Great Interregnum after the death of Frederick II in the mid-13th century, a period of over 20 years without a universally recognized emperor. During this time, the princes did not panic, they thrived. They solidified their own administrations, minted their own coins, and forged their own foreign alliances. When the monarchy was finally restored, it was as a shadow of its former self, permanently locked into a constitutional framework that recognized the princes as virtually independent rulers. The Holy Roman Empire became what historians later called a federation of princes, a loose confederation where the emperor presided but did not rule. The German map solidified into a stunning patchwork of hundreds of sovereign entities, from powerful kingdoms like Bohemia to tiny knightly territories no larger than a village. This was not a failure of state building, but a different political logic entirely, one that valued local autonomy and complex, negotiated harmony over centralized command. The ghost of Charlemagne's unified empire had finally been laid to rest, not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet treaties, leaving in its place two enduring models, one a centralized kingdom marching toward nationhood, the other a decentralized empire that would define the German-speaking world for centuries to come. Yet the ghost refused to be exorcised. Long after the last Carolingian king was forgotten and the German princes had solidified their power, the idea itself, the dream of a unified Christian empire, lived on with a stubborn, haunting persistence. This was not a political reality, but an ideology, a shimmering mirage of order that would tempt ambitious rulers for another 1,000 years. They called it imperium, a Latin word that meant more than just rule. It signified supreme, universal authority, a sacred mandate to bring peace and unity to all of Christendom. It was a story that proved more durable than any kingdom, a narrative that outlived the men who tried to embody it. Even as the map of Europe hardened into competing nations, the memory of that single, glorious realm under Charlemagne lingered in the collective imagination of the West, a lost golden age that begged to be restored. This ghostly ideal became a template, a yardstick against which every powerful monarch would eventually measure themselves, whether they admitted it or not. It was the ultimate political fantasy, and its power lay in its very impossibility. The most direct vessel for this idea was, of course, the institution that bore its name, the Holy Roman Empire. For centuries after Otto the Great, this peculiar entity endured, a political phantom that was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire in any meaningful administrative sense. Yet its very existence, however hollow, served a profound psychological purpose. It provided a continuous, unbroken link to the age of Charlemagne, a living artifact that kept the imperial idea from fading into mere legend. The coronation ceremony in Rome, where a German king was anointed by the Pope, was a ritual reenactment of that Christmas day in the year 800. Every time it happened, it whispered to all of Europe that the ancient unity was not dead, only sleeping, and that this man, this new emperor, was its rightful custodian. The title was a piece of conceptual magic, transforming a regional German king into the theoretical heir of the Caesars and the protector of the universal church. It allowed rulers like Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century to launch grand campaigns into Italy, not just for wealth, but to perform the role of emperor, to make the ghost walk again, if only for a season. The empire became a stage, and wearing its crown was the most prestigious role a ruler could play on the continent. But the ghost was not confined to Germany. It drifted across borders, inspiring and taunting kings who had no legitimate claim to the Roman title. In the year 800, Charlemagne had been crowned by the Pope, creating a precedent that entwined imperial legitimacy with papal approval. This created a tantalizing blueprint for any supremely powerful Christian monarch. Could they, too, earn that blessing? In England, centuries later, King Henry VIII would break with Rome and have himself declared the supreme head of the Church in England, consolidating spiritual and temporal power in his own person in a very imperial fashion. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would be portrayed in art and poetry as a new Augustus, presiding over a golden age of peace and learning, a direct echo of the imperial ideal applied to an island nation. The rulers of Spain, after the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, united their kingdoms and completed the Reconquista, saw themselves as the new champions of a unified Christendom. their conquistadors carrying the cross to new worlds with a sense of mission that felt distinctly imperial. They were not merely building a state, they were forging a new universal order under their crown. The ghost found its most literal and dramatic summoner in the person of Napoleon Bonaparte. By the turn of the 19th century, the Holy Roman Empire was a crumbling relic, a dusty constitutional framework that had long since lost its power. Napoleon simply ended it, dissolving the ancient institution in 1806. But he did not kill the ghost, he captured it. Just 2 years later, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, he took the imperial crown from the hands of the Pope and placed it on his own head. The symbolism was meticulous and breathtaking. He was consciously modeling himself on Charlemagne, claiming to be the unifier of Europe, the bringer of a new legal code, the founder of a new dynasty, and the heir to Rome. He even had a medieval-style eagle fashioned as his standard. His empire was a modern, centralized, bureaucratic state, but he cloaked it in the ancient mystique of imperium. He was not reviving the Holy Roman Empire. He was attempting to rebuild Charlemagne's empire itself, but with Paris, not Aachen or Rome, as its capital. His dramatic failure on the battlefields of Europe proved, once again, that the political reality of diverse nations was stronger than the unifying dream. Yet his attempt shows how potent the ghost remained, capable of inspiring even a revolutionary general to reach for a crown 1,000 years old. Why did this idea possess such enduring power? Because it answered a deep, recurring anxiety in the Western mind, the fear of chaos. The story of the fall of Rome and the subsequent Dark Ages was a foundational trauma. Charlemagne's empire represented the brief, glorious moment when that chaos was pushed back, when order, law, and faith were restored under a single, strong hand. In times of crisis, war, or religious schism, that memory glowed brighter. The idea of imperium promised safety, stability, and a shared identity that transcended local quarrels. It was a story of rescue. For intellectuals and poets, it provided a grand narrative for history itself, a teleology where mankind was slowly working its way back to a lost unity. For the Church, it offered the vision of a perfect partnership between spiritual and secular power, guiding humanity toward salvation. And for ambitious rulers, it was the ultimate source of legitimacy, a way to say their power was not mere accident or brute force, but part of a divine and historical plan that stretched back to Constantine and Augustus. The ghost was useful. It was a tool for persuasion, a source of inspiration, and a weapon against rivals. In the end, the political fragmentation after Charlemagne was permanent. The nation-state, not the universal empire, became the building block of the modern world. But the ideological victory of the imperial idea was almost as complete. It shaped the ambitions of kings, the art of courts, the theories of philosophers, and the very way Europe told its own story. It created a tension that would define the continent, a constant pull between the centrifugal force of local identity and the centripetal dream of unity. We see its echoes even today in the slow, fraught project of the European Union, another attempt to find peaceful unity among ancient rivals. The ghost of Charlemagne's empire never walked again in solid form, but it never left the room. It remains there still, in the architecture of our institutions and the deepest layers of our political imagination, a reminder of a time when the West dared to believe it could be one. The great unmaking of an empire was not a story of failure but of transformation. The relentless struggles of the 9th and 10th centuries, the civil wars, the broken treaties, the desperate bids for a hollow crown, did not lead back to Charlemagne's world. They led out of it, forging something entirely new from the fragments, the very forces that shattered the Carolingian realm, the ambitions of local lords, the pressures of invasion, the stubborn realities of geography and language, were the same forces that sculpted the foundational shapes of modern Europe. In the west, the slow, patient consolidation of the Capetian kings around the Isle de France would gradually knit together the Kingdom of France, a state defined by a centralizing monarchy and a unifying royal law. In the east, the Ottoman and Salian emperors, by working with and through the powerful German princes and the Imperial Church, presided over the creation of a different political organism, the Holy Roman Empire, a decentralized, federative structure that prioritized the autonomy of its constituent parts. The space between them, the old Middle Kingdom of Lotharingia, became a permanent zone of contest, a fractured corridor of duchies and counties that would be fought over for centuries, embedding a rivalry into the continent's very bones. And from the ground up, in response to the collapse of central protection, arose the feudal order, a world of castles, personal oaths, and localized justice that became the social and military fabric of the Middle Ages. This was the profound and paradoxical legacy, the dream of rebuilding the empire pursued so desperately by Louis the Pious, Charles the Bald, and Otto the Great, never truly died, yet its pursuit is what made the dream permanently impossible. Each attempt to resurrect the ghost forced a new political innovation, a new balance of power that further cemented the divisions. The imperial title became a prestigious symbol, but the reality on the map was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and lordships. This fragmented landscape, born from the ashes of unity, defined European political geography for the next 1,000 years. It set the stage for the rise of nation-states, the endless wars over territory, and the complex tapestry of cultures we recognize today. The end of the Carolingian era was not a full stop in history's book, but a dramatic turning of the page. If you found this journey from unity to fragmentation compelling, consider exploring the stories that grew from this new world. The rise of the Norman knights, the epic crusades, or the cunning politics of the medieval papacy. Each is a branch from this same fractured trunk, a next chapter in the story of how Europe built itself from the pieces of a broken crown.